Boy oh boy, some countries have screwed up their housing markets. And guess who's the worst? Australia and Canada. Both Australia and Canada have managed to do untold damage to their housing markets, which could end up being irreparable. In the process, they're pushing millions of people towards poverty, and scarily, they're on a very dangerous path that could end up leading to economic collapse. I'm Biko Konstantinos, and that's what we're going to talk about today. I know what you're thinking. Nearly every developed country have somehow screwed up their housing markets. And yes, I agree, but I'm singling out Australia and Canada for a reason. So stick around and enjoy the show. And if you enjoy it, please like this video and consider subscribing to my channel. I'll provide you with independent analysis and commentary, and we'll have a bit of fun along the way. Won't we, baby? Mwah. Mwah. In recent years, Australia and Canada have had some of the most expensive housing in the entire developed world. In just a few decades, these two countries have gone from having affordable housing to ridiculously unaffordable. Even before COVID, house prices were considered overextended because for many years, they rose way faster than actual wages. A clear example of this is the 2019 Demographia Housing Affordability Report. And if we look at the rankings for the worst affordable housing markets, Hong Kong was the worst, but after that we've got Vancouver, Canada, Sydney, Australia, Melbourne, Australia, Tauranga, New Zealand, Los Angeles, USA, Toronto, Canada, and then Auckland, New Zealand. So this was before COVID, and it was clear that Australia and Canada had a serious problem with housing affordability. And New Zealand's also in the mix, and they're a very honourable member for stuffing up their housing market. G'day to all my Kiwi buddies. Okay, so we're starting off from an extremely unaffordable level for housing, and then COVID hit. And guess what? Every country followed the same playbook. They propped up the housing market, implemented unprecedented stimulus measures, and reduced interest rates to near zero and kept them there way too long. How do I know this? Well, because 2021 was the year of the everything bubble. There was crazy speculation everywhere because governments and central banks basically scorched their economies, sending them into overdrive. Now, the speculative demand that was generated due to these government and central bank policies was something to behold. Houses became sought after more than water in the desert, and even more than Taylor Swift tickets.
The line has stopped moving. The website fully crashed. I waited in line.
Did you get yours? So when you create conditions that encourage massive speculative crazy demand in countries like Australia and Canada, where people were already obsessed with property because it's been one of the main wealth creators over recent years, well, you just end up with a feeding frenzy. The countries where housing affordability was the worst basically rose the most during COVID. And when you see house prices rise 30%, 40%, and even more in less than a 2-year period, there's something gravely wrong. So for non-property owners, not only has it forever prevented some people from ever owning a home, but on top of that, renters have been lumped with a rental crisis. Where there's massive demand and competition for rentals, prices going through the roof, which is pushing many renters towards poverty and some onto the streets. How is it possible that housing, which is a basic human requirement, to go up so fast in such a short period of time without there being absolute uproar in the media? I don't understand why it's not still being talked about, debated, and frankly investigated and protested over. And I think the reason why is because many people own property and they're ultra happy about it. And I get it. But housing shouldn't be a speculative asset that people would trade on. It's not like a cryptocurrency that you want to buy cheap and hopefully make 50%. It's a bloody place to live, man. And people need places to live. When you've got hardworking Australians and Canadians who can't even afford a home, where the hell did we go wrong? So after flooding the economy with stimulus and cheap debt, inflation rose sharply, so both Australia and Canada had to hike interest rates very sharply. But like nearly every other country country, they were way too late. They let crazy speculation go rampant, and by the time they started raising rates, massive damage had already been done. Because both countries have made millions of people desperate for property. Investors are desperate because they keep wanting to make amazing gains from property, but renters are probably even more desperate because they want to get out of the crisis. So both countries have basically facilitated this giant fear of missing out emotion in their countries. And then they've also facilitated despair, probably depression, massive anxiety from people worried about having just a place to live. So what did Australia and Canada do to try and solve this giant issue? Just go on one of the biggest immigration benders you've ever seen. They opened the immigration floodgates to levels never seen before. I mean, check out Canada's year-on-year population growth. In the last 12 months, the Canadian population has grown by 1.2 million. Yes, there was a little downturn during COVID, but they've gone all in, haven't they? You know, if you organize a party and you invite a few friends, but someone posts it on social media and you have a ton of gate crashes, so instead of 20 people, you end up with 300 coming to your party? Well, this is just like that, except 1,000 times worse. I mean, just have a look at this Canadian population growth when you compare it to the US population growth. The difference is absolutely staggering. Now look at the rental vacancy rates in the US. During COVID, they fell to around 4%, but just recently they've risen back to around 7%. So a 7% vacancy rate provides excellent choice for renters and helps to keep rent prices lower. Compare that to what's happening in Australia and Canada for renters. Australia is also implementing a record immigration policy, which is surging the population, and this trend is set to continue. But at the same time, so many building developers have collapsed recently, and because costs have skyrocketed, dwelling completions is falling. At the same time, population growth is surging. So we've got population growth on steroids, less than normal dwelling completions. This could be a problem. Of course it's a bloody problem. Australia and Canada artificially inflated house prices, created a rental crisis, and their solution? Make everything 10 times worse by importing the crap out of people. I mean, I get the importance of immigration, and I'm not complaining about it one bit, but I am complaining about record immigration when we already have massive demand and competition, which will now get so much worse because you've got more people competing for less properties. So this brings me to the real reason I believe that Australia and Canada have totally screwed the housing market and perhaps done irreparable damage. And that is the fact that even after super sharp interest rate hikes, house prices in both countries have started rising again quite sharply in 2023. Now, normally after such a huge rise in house prices, which was artificially inflated due to unprecedented policies, you would expect that the reversal of one of those policies, so going from ultra cheap debt to raising the debt levels super fast, would start to deflate the housing market. And yes, it did for a little bit, but guess what? House prices in Australia and Canada have started rising quite strongly again. We can see here how Canadian house prices peaked in early 2022, declined quite sharply, but just look at what's happened in 2023. Basically defying gravity by being very strong at the same time interest rates are being hiked. And looking at Australian house prices, with this blue line showing a good representation, you can see a very similar pattern where there was initial falls, but recently in 2023, prices have strengthened considerably. To understand how crazy these recent house price rises are, let's look at the interest rate rises, and we can see Canada hiked very sharply, paused for a few months in 2023, and has recently started rising again all the way to 5%. Now here's the Australian interest rate hikes going all the way up to 4.1%. Now this is actually a very significant rate in Australia because Australians are one of the most indebted nations towards property. So we've got two countries where house prices are ultra elevated, which means you have to get very large mortgages to buy a property. Interest rates have skyrocketed, meaning the interest you have to pay on those large mortgages is quite astronomical, yet still house prices have gone up. This is not the sign of normal healthy housing markets. This is more like a drug-fueled bender where we've supplied the entire population with free drugs, and in our case those drugs are never-ending house price rises. And both Australia and Canada are making sure everyone stays addicted by doing everything in their power to make sure house prices stay ultra high. It's like a giant Ponzi scheme, which is why I said at the start of this video it could lead to collapse, because down the track Australia and Canada could start reducing interest rates again, create another speculative boom, and prices just get so high that eventually the majority of people just can't afford them. And when you no longer have buyers, that's when the Ponzi will end. I'm Biko Konstantinos.